The northern vales had no gentle season. Even in late autumn, when the birches still clung to their gold, the wind off the Greymount peaks carried a knife in it, a cold that didn't simply chill the body but reached into the bones and reminded you what you were, small, mortal, and entirely at the mercy of things larger than yourself. Genevieve Miller had learned this early. She was 22 years old and had not been warm since she was 16. Not truly warm, the deep, drowsy warmth of a body that had eaten enough, slept enough, and did not have to rise before dawn to make sure the kitchen fires were banked before the noble household stirred. She had forgotten what that warmth felt like, the same way she had gradually forgotten the sound of her youngest brother's laugh, the smell of her mother's hair, and the particular blue of the sky over the cottage where she had been born. The sweating sickness had taken them all in the third winter after she turned 17. Mother first, then Pip and Colm in the same terrible week. She had buried them herself, in the frozen churchyard of Lower Vale Gate, with no one to help her and no one to witness. And then, because she had no other choice and because she was the kind of person who kept moving even when there was nowhere good to move to, she had walked the 12 miles to Stonebridge Keep and asked for work. The head housekeeper, a wiry, suspicious woman named Marta, had looked her over with the flat, assessing gaze of a woman who purchased livestock. "You're small," Marta had said. "I'm strong," Genevieve had answered. "You're human." "So are you." Marta had hired her, if only out of grudging respect for the answer. That had been 5 years ago. Now Genevieve knew every stone in the keep's kitchen, every temperamental draft from the east-facing windows, every trick of the enormous iron cauldrons that scalded you if you tilted them wrong. She knew which guards slipped extra food from the pantry and which maids stole silver polish to sell in the village. She knew, though she rarely spoke of it, that the tall, golden-eyed predators who swept through the corridors and filled the grand halls with their laughter and their territorial posturing viewed her and the other human servants approximately the way they viewed the flagstones they walked on. Useful. Unnoticed. Underfoot. The lichens of Stonebridge Keep were a specific and ancient strain of werewolf nobility, the kind who had spent so many generations at the top of the hierarchy that the hierarchy had ceased to feel like a choice and had calcified into the natural order of the universe itself. They were beautiful and they were frightening, with their shifting golden eyes, their preternatural speed, and the low, subharmonic authority in their voices that made the air vibrate. Even the weakest lichen lord could silence a room of humans with a single exhalation of breath. At the apex of this world sat King Rodrik Harrington. Genevieve had seen him twice at a distance, once riding out to meet a southern delegation, mounted on a black destrier with his dark cloak spreading behind him like a crow's wings, and once across the great hall at a feast she was serving, his head bent in intense conversation with his war council, the candlelight catching the severe planes of his face. He was enormous, even by lichen standards, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw cut from granite and the kind of stillness that very dangerous things possessed, the stillness of a predator conserving energy. She had not thought much about him either time. He was not part of her world. He was weather, something you moved around, adapted to, waited out. What was part of her world, and had been for 3 months now, was the slow unraveling happening in the royal wing. Dowager Queen Beatrice Harrington had once been spoken of in whispers, and not the fearful kind, the reverent kind. She had been an alpha's alpha, a woman who had ridden to war alongside her husband and earned the respect of lords twice her size through sheer, uncompromising force of will. Portraits of her in the corridors showed a woman of severe elegance, her silver-streaked hair swept back, her gold eyes clear and cold as Arctic light. The woman currently in the royal wing was a ghost wearing her body. The mind blight was cruelly named because it was exactly that, a blight, a withering of the higher functions, the parts of a lichen that were specifically human, language, memory, social awareness, dignity. What it left behind was the animal, confused and frightened, trapped in surroundings it could no longer comprehend, prey to terrors it couldn't articulate. In a human, it would have been tragic. In a lichen, it was considered shameful, a failure of the blood, and the highborn of Stonebridge handled it accordingly. Maester Leonis, the royal physician, visited twice a week with great ceremony, examined the queen for exactly 4 minutes, and prescribed enough sedative poppy syrup to keep her in a half-conscious stupor that he privately described as manageable. The noble nurses assigned to her care were daughters of lesser lords who had come to the keep seeking political proximity to the king, and none of them had signed up to manage an incontinent elder wolf with a degraded higher mind. They kept the doors to her wing closed. They kept the windows shut against the November chill, and so the room accumulated its own terrible weather system of stale air, sickness, and despair. They were not monsters, most of them. They were simply people who had decided, at some crucial juncture, that their discomfort was more important than someone else's suffering, and who had then constructed enough justifications around that decision that they had stopped noticing it was a decision at all. Genevieve had been sent to the royal wing to clean the hearth ash. It was one of the tasks no one else wanted because the royal wing at night was cold and far from the kitchens and the ash got on everything. She was carrying her bucket and a long-handled brush when she slipped through the side door of the dowager's antechamber, stepped around the corner, and stopped. The room was barely lit, one low candle guttering in its holder. The enormous fireplace had burned down to embers. And there, wedged into the narrow gap between the carved oak headboard and the stone wall, was Beatrice Harrington, former Luna of the Northern Vales, crouched in the trembling specific way that bodies crouched when they had lost trust in the floor and were trying to make themselves as small as possible. Her nightgown was ruined. Her silver hair was matted to one side of her face. She was shaking so hard that Genevieve could hear her teeth clacking together from across the room, and she was making a sound, a low, keening sound, entirely animal, entirely wrong, that raised every hair on the back of Genevieve's neck. The noble nurses were not there. They were, Genevieve would later learn, 2 floors down in the east sitting room, working through a bottle of spiced wine and complaining about the quality of the court seamstress. Later, in the years that followed, when people asked Genevieve what made her do what she did next, enter royal chambers uninvited, touch royal flesh without permission, commit a dozen infractions for which a human servant could legally lose their hands, she could never give a satisfying answer. It was not calculation. It was not bravery, exactly. It was more that she looked at the woman in the corner and saw a person, and the person needed help, and she had help to give, and that was simply the end of the arithmetic. She set down her ash bucket. She bolted the heavy oak door from the inside. And she went to work, the basin she filled from the small kettle still warm above the coals. The lavender she carried herself, a small folded square of cloth she'd been given weeks ago by one of the village traders in exchange for some mending, a luxury she'd been hoarding, intending to make a sachet for her pillowcase. She tore it open over the basin without hesitation. "There you are," she murmured softly, approaching the huddled figure with the slow, unthreatening movements she'd once used approaching a neighbor's skittish horse. "There you are. I see you. You're all right." Beatrice's feral eyes tracked her, huge and golden and terrified. Her lips peeled back slightly. Genevieve did not stop moving. She sat cross-legged on the cold floor, a foot away, well within biting range, and looked steadily at the former Luna until the keening dropped in pitch and the shaking marginally subsided. "My name is Genevieve," she said conversationally, as though they were meeting in a garden. "I clean the hearths. You don't know me and I don't know you except by your portraits, which, if I'm honest, make you look rather scary. I suspect you're not particularly scary right now, though." Something in the elder woman's expression flickered. Not recognition, not yet. But a shift, an adjustment of the frequency, a tuning toward a human voice the way a face turns, involuntarily, toward warmth. "Let's get you cleaned up," Genevieve said. "And then, if you don't bite me, I have a piece of venison in my apron pocket that the cook doesn't know I took, and we'll share it. How does that sound?" Beatrice did not bite her. The cleaning was slow, careful, and required both improvisation and a complete suspension of the instinct toward self-preservation. The elder woman was stronger than she looked, even in her deteriorated state, a reminder that the frail shell housed a predator. But Genevieve had grown up managing frightened animals, frightened siblings, and frightened grief, and had learned that gentleness, applied consistently and without flinching, could soften most things. She stripped the ruined nightgown. She bathed the old woman with the lavender water, working in sections, keeping up a low, steady murmur of speech about nothing in particular, the weather, the kitchen cats, a funny thing she had observed about the head groom's boots. She found a clean wool shift in the chest at the foot of the bed and dressed Beatrice in it. She remade the bed with the clean linen stacked in the wardrobe, helped the dowager settle against the pillows, and then, keeping her word, split the stolen venison. Beatrice ate every bite from her palm, watching her with those immense golden eyes. When she had finished, she did something that unmade Genevieve entirely. She reached out and took Genevieve's roughened, cracked hand in both of hers and held it. She didn't speak. Perhaps she had no words. But she held on, and eventually, by degrees, the terrible tension went out of her shoulders, and she slept. Genevieve sat in the chair beside the bed for a long time, listening to the deep, even breathing, the sound of a person finally safe enough to rest. Then she picked up her ash bucket and her brush and slipped back through the door into the dark corridor, and went back to the kitchens, and did not speak of it to anyone. She went back the next night. She told herself it was because she needed to know the dowager was all right. She told herself this for about 3 nights before she stopped requiring a justification and simply went. It became, over the weeks that followed, the most organized secret she had ever kept. She developed a system. She would take the ash removal rounds in the royal wing as often as Marta would permit, easy enough, since no one else wanted the assignment. She accumulated a small pharmacopoeia of herbs through the keep's trades, hawthorn berries from the kitchen garden, dried mint from the apothecary supply she replenished with a week's worth of saved wages, chamomile when she could get it. She begged a bristle brush from the laundress and kept it tucked in her uniform. She learned, through careful observation and extensive improvised trial and error, what specific routines calmed Beatrice during the feral episodes and what provoked them. The hawthorn tea, which Dr. Johannes Weyer, the human physician in Lower Valegate who occasionally treated the keep servant staff, had once mentioned in passing was good for the aging heart, she brewed herself each night. She had never spoken to the doctor directly about the dowager, that would have been too dangerous. She simply remembered everything he had said in passing and applied it carefully. Slowly, and this was the thing that kept bringing her back, the thing that felt miraculous against the backdrop of her otherwise unmiraculous life, slowly, Beatrice began to improve. Not in a linear way. Not in a way that Maester Lyonis, who would not have noticed if the dowager had started reciting epic poetry, would have recognized. But Genevieve noticed. The violent feral episodes grew shorter and further apart. The long stretches of blankness began to contain islands of clarity, moments when Beatrice would look at Genevieve with clear eyes and real recognition, and say something wholly lucid. "Your hands are cold, girl. Sit closer to the fire." Or, "You smell of lavender. I used to grow lavender in the East Garden." The stench of sickness and neglect that had saturated the room gradually gave way to something clean, something that smelled of the herbs and the pine logs crackling in the hearth. Genevieve was careful not to let herself feel too much about it. She had loved people before and lost them, and the scar tissue that had formed over those losses was serviceable and necessary. But there were nights, cold, late nights when Beatrice was sleeping peacefully and Genevieve was sitting in the chair braiding the elder woman's hair simply because she had found that the repetitive motion seemed to help, even asleep, when she allowed herself the small, private warmth of knowing that she was doing something that mattered. It was enough. It was more than most people got. She didn't think about the king. She thought about him the way she thought about the great stone walls. She was aware of him as a structural fact, a load-bearing element of the world she moved through. His presence upstairs, his voice occasionally heard through ceiling and floor as an indistinct authority, his footsteps in the royal wing on the evenings he visited his mother, these were weather. You adapted. She was aware, in the abstract way of someone noting an object at the periphery of their vision, that he had begun to notice the change in his mother. The nurses had noticed it too, and their initial unease, fearing they would be blamed for whatever mysterious improvement was occurring, had settled into relief, since no one was asking them questions and they were quite content to take quiet credit by association. Genevieve took care to be invisible. She was practiced at it. Lady Constance of House Waverley was not invisible. She was magnificently, strategically visible. Visibility, for Constance, was a craft. She worked at it the way a sculptor works at stone, with patience, deliberate force, and an eye for the specific angles that made her appear at her absolute best. She was, by any honest assessment, genuinely beautiful, tall, with the amber eyes and prominent bone structure of old lichen blood, and a quality of self-possession that read, in the right light, as dignity. She was also intelligent, which was more dangerous than beauty. She understood power the way a general understood terrain, as something to be read, mapped, and exploited. She had come to Stonebridge 2 years ago with a clear objective, the crown. Not the crown by conquest, she wasn't a fool. The crown by marriage, by the patient, systematic process of making herself indispensable to King Rodrik in all the ways he hadn't yet realized he needed. She attended every council meeting she could engineer an invitation to. She agreed with him in public and offered private opinions that subtly shaped his thinking without threatening his ego. She wore colors that complemented the keep's midnight blue banners. She was, in short, doing everything correctly, and it was working. She had expected to be queen within a year. The mate bond was the only variable she couldn't control, and she had made peace with the probability that Rodrik simply didn't have a fated mate. Many lichens didn't, and chose their partners by alliance and temperament. She was ideal on both counts. She noticed the improvement in the Dowager Queen because she noticed everything. And the night she lingered in the shadows of the royal wing and watched a soot-stained human girl slip from Beatrice's chambers carrying soiled linens, her keen mind processed it immediately, assessed it from every angle, and arrived at a conclusion that was both terrible and efficient. She wouldn't report the girl. She would become the girl. She would claim credit for the care, accept the gratitude, use the intimacy that gratitude created to position herself permanently in Rodrik's emotional life, and the human servant would simply continue her work, invisibly, as she was accustomed to doing, or be quietly removed. It was, Constance told herself, simply practical. She had not, in her careful maps of terrain and power, ever bothered to map the geography of consequences. She presented herself to the king the following morning with an expression of such exquisitely calibrated exhausted selflessness that it was almost an artistic achievement. The simple gown. The shadows arranged under her eyes with a touch of ash from her own fireplace. The reluctant, halting confession of weeks of nocturnal devotion. Rodrik, who was an excellent military tactician and a perceptive judge of aggression, was considerably less skilled at recognizing the specific emotional manipulations of court women, largely because he spent very little time worrying about them. He had been conditioned by a lifetime of lichen hierarchy to grant automatic credibility to the noble and to regard human servants as furniture. These two facts were the perfect architecture for the lie Constance had built, and she walked through the door his blindness had opened without a moment's hesitation. He kissed her hands. He called her the heart of a Luna. Constance smiled and thought, finally. She found Genevieve in the laundry courtyard that afternoon, wringing out heavy linens in the bone-cold water, her hands cracked and raw and reddened to the elbow. The threat she delivered was efficiently designed, as Constance's projects always were: claim credit, you die badly. Continue the work invisibly, you live badly. The arithmetic was simple. Genevieve, holding the wrist that Constance's nails had punctured, looked at the beautiful noble woman for a long, steady moment. She was not particularly afraid, which surprised her faintly. She had already been a long time in the territory of having very little to lose. What she felt instead was a complex, layered revulsion, at Constance's confidence, yes, but more at the casual, efficient certainty with which the woman had assumed that Genevieve's welfare would matter less than Constance's convenience. The certainty with which she had been assessed and dismissed and bargained. "I understand," Genevieve said. She went back that night and every night after, and she did not speak of it to anyone. For Beatrice's sake. Not out of fear, though she was afraid. For the old woman who held her hand in the dark and smelled of lavender and, on clear nights, looked at Genevieve with golden eyes bright as lamps and said, "I know you. You are my sparrow. You came back." The winter solstice fell on a Thursday that year, and the keep had been preparing for the feast for 2 weeks. Genevieve had been aware, in the way of background noise, that something significant was being planned in the great hall. She'd overheard enough in the kitchens to understand that Constance was expecting an announcement, that she had been purchasing bolts of crimson silk in the village, that a ruby necklace of significant weight had been commissioned from the keep's goldsmith. She had filed this information in the part of her mind where she stored things that were not her problem and kept her attention on the parts that were. Beatrice was having a difficult night. The mind blight came in tides, sometimes retreating enough that Beatrice seemed almost herself, and sometimes rolling in like storm weather, dark and total. Tonight the tide was high. She had been restless since evening, confused and frightened, refusing the tea, recoiling from the fire that Genevieve kept carefully banked against the December cold. Her hands were shaking and she had been unable to eat. Genevieve had sat with her for an hour, speaking softly, letting the elder woman hold her hands, patiently waiting out the terror the way you wait out a storm. When Beatrice had finally begun to settle, she had started on a thin broth she'd begged from the cook, easier to digest, warm, the fat from the beef bones containing enough sustenance to help. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with the bowl, spooning it carefully into Beatrice's mouth, so focused on the task that she did not hear the door. She heard him before she saw him, a sharp intake of breath, an abrupt stillness, the particular quality of a very large, very controlled body suddenly stopping mid-motion. She turned. King Rodrik Harrington stood in the doorway of his mother's chambers, dressed for a feast, the midnight blue doublet, the silver clasp at his throat, the dark hair pulled back from his face, and staring at her with an expression that she would later think of as the face of a man who believes he is seeing exactly what he fears most. The silver spoon. Her soiled work dress. The bowl of dark liquid. His mother, confused, plucking at the sheets. She watched the story write itself across his face, thief, poisoner, traitor. Watched him reach for the explanation that cost him least and required him to question nothing about the world he believed in. Watched him become certain. She opened her mouth to explain. Constance came through the door like a blade. The shout of guards split the room. The bowl shattered. The broth spread in a dark stain across the flagstones. Genevieve found herself on her knees, not struck down yet, simply reduced there by the tidal force of a noble woman's panicked fury, by the rush of the guards through the door, by the crushing velocity of the situation closing around her. She looked up at the king. She looked at his face, so certain, so complete in its condemnation, and she understood suddenly and terribly that this certainty was not personal, it was structural. He was not looking at her. He was looking at what she was, a human, a servant, a category. The category was criminal, and the verdict was already in. She could not reach him through the category. There was no argument available to her that would carry enough weight to counteract what he had been raised to believe about people like her. "Please," she said, and meant, "please see me. Please look at me rather than at what I am." I was only feeding her. The alpha command that came from him hit the air of the room like a physical event, a subsonic wave that she felt in her sternum. She understood, in that trembling instant, something visceral about the lichened power structure that she had only ever understood abstractly, that it was not merely social, not merely political. It was literal. The authority was in the voice. The authority was in the body. And there was no argument, no evidence, no truth that could fly fast enough to outrun the instinctive, animal response it provoked. Take her to the dungeons. The guards dragged her by her arms. The door of the solar cut her off from the candlelight, from the feast smell and the warmth. The stone stairs spiraled down into cold. She did not fight. It would have been pointless, and she spent her energy on the one thing she could still do. She called back over her shoulder, "The hawthorn tea. Please. She needs it for her heart." The gauntlet caught her across the face like a door slamming shut. The black cells beneath Stonebridge Keep were exactly as terrible as their name promised. The walls wept. The floor was stone that had spent centuries absorbing cold. There was no light, not the absence of adequate light, but the absolute negation of it, the kind of dark that becomes a pressure, a presence. Genevieve lay in the corner and did not waste energy on things she could not change. Her face swelled rapidly, heat radiating outward from where the gauntlet had connected, which she recognized dimly as a bad sign. She could not see the wound, but she could feel its architecture, deep, contaminated, the kind that would go wrong quickly in these conditions. She thought about Beatrice, alone in the room above with no one to make the tea and no one to sit with her through the feral nights. She thought about Pip and Colm, the particular weight of small bodies in her arms, the specific pitch of their voices. She thought about the blue sky over the cottage. She did not think about the king. He had been weather, and weather had done what weather does. She pulled her knees to her chest and waited. 2 stories above, the great hall had never looked more magnificent. 1,000 beeswax candles. Roasted boar and spiced venison. Lords and ladies in their finest velvets, the keep's midnight banners swept back to reveal the soaring stone arches, the massive solstice decorations of evergreen and white holly berry. Music from the gallery, the warm undercurrent of collective human Anglican celebration filling the room like a tide. At the high table, Rodrik Harrington was standing. Golden goblet raised. His face set in the particular expression of a man about to say something publicly final, something that will close a chapter and begin a new one. Constance, at his side in her crimson silk and her rubies, was already composing her expression into the precise combination of surprised joy and gracious composure she had been rehearsing for 2 years. The great hall doors opened. The music stopped. The way music stops, not because the musicians have received a signal but because the musicians, without consultation, collectively understand that something has occurred which renders their contribution irrelevant. Beatrice Harrington had been alone for 3 days. In those 3 days, without the hawthorn tea, without the lavender, without the low steady human voice that had been her anchor to the rational world, the tide of the mind blight had come in and not gone back out. She had been unable to find water. Constance had instructed the noble nurses not to enter the chambers, she didn't want anyone discovering the state of things before the announcement. Beatrice had torn the sheets trying to escape from dreams she couldn't locate the edges of. She had called for people who were not there, in a language the mind blight had reduced to sound rather than meaning. On the 3rd day, the solstice full moon rose. The lunar cycle had always been Beatrice's element. Even now, even deep in the degraded animal of the mind blight, some inherited reflex oriented toward the moon with the uncomplicated certainty of a plant toward light. The full solstice moon through the stained glass windows of her chambers was the most powerful lunar event of the year. It was not enough to cure her. But it was enough, briefly, to cut through. The door she had torn apart with her hands was, as it turned out, not as well reinforced as it should have been. She walked through the keep in her torn nightgown on bare feet, following the light and the music and the pull of some navigational instinct older than language, and she came through the great doors of the hall trailing ruin and revelation in equal measure. The silence that fell was not the polite silence of people making room for a latecomer. It was the silence of a collective breath held still in a room that no longer knew what it was witnessing. Constance was already backing away from the high table, her beautiful face stripped of its performance, the panic beneath it undisguised and undeniable. She knew, before Beatrice said a word, she knew, what the feral, lucid fury in those golden eyes meant, what the pointing finger meant, what the croak of viper meant. She had known it was a possibility all along. She had simply reasoned that by the time it became a probability, she would be far enough up the hierarchy that the consequences would land elsewhere. She had miscalculated the timeline. Beatrice moved to the center of the hall with the strange, unsteady dignity of a woman running on something beyond physical resources, will, fury, a maternal love that had survived the collapse of nearly everything else. Her alpha aura, the commanding force she had spent 40 years cultivating, had not been touched by the mind blight. It was structural, bone deep, older than the damage. When she released it, the hall contracted around it, lesser nobles sank to their knees without intending to, their wolves submitting instinctively to an authority they recognized as categorically superior. "She left me to rot," Beatrice said. And then, turning to look at her son across the candlelit hall, with tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face, she was the one. The human girl. The little sparrow from the ashes. She washed me and sang to me and brought lavender and fed me from her own plate, and you arrogant, foolish, blind boy, you threw her in the dark. Beatrice's legs gave out then. She caught herself on the arm of a nearby lord, who held her without thinking, moved by something beyond protocol. She looked at her son. Her voice, reduced to a whisper, nonetheless carried every inch of the hall's stone length. "You let a viper take credit for an angel's work. And you never once asked yourself why the lavender smell was wrong. You never asked yourself anything about the woman who gave me back my last months of dignity." She coughed, a terrible wet cough that shook her whole body. Her hand pressed to her chest. "Get her out of the dark, Rodrik. Get her out now." She was unconscious before she finished the sentence. Rodrik's goblet had hit the floor of the dais and he was already moving before the sound finished echoing. He did not stop to address Constance. He did not stop to receive the confession that was already pouring out of her in a flood of self-serving justifications. He did not stop for anything. He signaled his beta with a single gesture, "Hold them," and he ran. The dungeon key was iron and heavy, and the jailer's hands were shaking as he handed it over. He had been jailer for 11 years and had never seen the king below the keep's lower kitchens, let alone down here, down in the place where the walls wept and the cold was its own living thing. Rodrik took the ring without looking at him and moved at a pace that was not quite running, something faster, more controlled, the leashed sprint of a lichen restraining its speed to avoid knocking the stone walls apart. The door to the black cell was 3 inches of iron. He had it open in seconds. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes adjusted, lichen sight, instantaneous even in absolute darkness. The cell resolved from nothing into gray shapes, and the smallest gray shape, tucked in the corner against the wall where the floor met the wet stone, was so still that his heart performed a hideous freefall in his chest. No. He crossed the cell in 2 strides and dropped to his knees. The smell hit him then. He would think about this moment for the rest of his life, how he had been in the kitchens 100 times while she was there and hadn't known. How he had passed through the royal wing a dozen times in the weeks she'd been tending his mother and hadn't noticed. How the layers of smoke and ash and kitchen grease and medicinal lavender had masked it completely, this scent, this specific combination of rain on dry earth and crushed violets that his wolf recognized in his blood and marrow as the one thing he had been looking for since the day he had come of age. His fated mate. His. Here. 3 inches from dying in a cell he had put her in. "No," he said aloud, the word tearing out of him rough and broken. He gathered her up, she weighed almost nothing, which broke something in him, the awareness of how little she had been fed, and pressed her against his chest, his lichen body heat spiking automatically, trying to force warmth into her frozen flesh. "Genevieve. Please." She did not respond. Her breathing was a shallow, wrong thing, barely a breath at all. The left side of her face, where the gauntlet had struck, was swollen into an ugly dark mass, the infection's heat a terrible contrast to the cold of the rest of her. He had done this. He had looked at her in the royal chambers and seen a category, peasant, criminal, lesser, and had not once attempted to look past it. He had taken the story that was easiest to believe, the story that required him to examine nothing about himself or his world, and he had signed her death warrant with the blind, arrogant efficiency of a man accustomed to having his judgments be correct simply because he was the one making them. The weight of that arrived all at once, in the dark of the cell, concrete and catastrophic. He carried her up through the keep. All the stairs. All the corridors. Past the staring faces of the assembled nobles, who had followed from the great hall and now stood in the corridors of the royal wing watching their Alpha King lay a filthy, half-dead scullery maid on his own velvet-canopied bed with the focused, desperate care of a man handling something he cannot afford to break. The reckoning of Constance of House Waverley was not held in a closed council chamber. Rodrik, who had spent 3 sleepless days beside Genevieve's bed watching Dr. Johannes Weyer, the human physician from Lower Valegate, the only person in the keep who actually knew what to do with a human body in this state, fight an increasingly grim battle against infection and hypothermia and pneumonia, who had sat on the cold floor rather than the chair because the chair felt like more comfort than he deserved, who had felt, through the newly formed mate bond, every hour of Genevieve's pain and cold and the bone-deep weight of her exhaustion and sadness. Rodrik held the trial in the central courtyard, on a grey winter morning, in front of every living person within the keep's walls. He had a specific reason for this. He wanted no one to be able to say, later, that they had not known. He wanted the shape of the crime clearly witnessed and the shape of the consequence clearly witnessed, so that neither could be eroded by the private reinterpretations of the powerful. Constance arrived in the courtyard in her silk and her rubies, because she had not yet fully understood that those days were over. She arrived assuming that even now, even at this late stage, her status would purchase her some modification of outcome. She was still, at the core of herself, the woman who had looked at Genevieve wringing laundry in the cold and calculated the price of her silence, because the price of someone like Genevieve's silence would naturally be lower than the price of someone like Constance's. That was simply how the arithmetic worked. The arithmetic, as it turned out, had been running a different calculation all along. Lord Waverley, her father, who had taught her everything she knew about the relationship between wealth and entitlement, knelt beside her in the courtyard. The rubies at her throat had already been removed, along with the silk. In their place, burlap. The exact uniform of the maid she had despised. Rodrik did not shout. He did not need to. When the formal charges were read, high treason, gross neglect resulting in the death of the Dowager Queen, attempted murder of the king's fated mate, the silence in the courtyard was so complete that you could hear the snow falling. When Constance wept and called Genevieve a peasant, a filthy worthless human, and insisted she had done what she had to do for the realm, the silence that followed her words was not the silence of people reconsidering her. It was the silence of people watching someone reveal, under pressure, exactly who they had always been. That peasant, Rodrik said, is my fated mate. The collective intake of breath from the assembled nobles was, in later accounts, described as physical, a seismic event, a shift in the atmosphere of the courtyard. To harm a Lycan king's fated mate was sacrilege. Not political sacrilege. Sacred sacrilege, a violation of the deepest law in their world. Constance was sick on the cobblestones. The sentence Rodrik delivered became, over generations, the thing he was most remembered for, not his military campaigns or his administrative reforms, but this specific and precise mapping of punishment to crime. House Waverley, stripped. Every coin, every acre, every title, every sword. The wealth distributed to the human villages of the lower valleys, who had been taxed by the Waverleys for a century and given nothing in return. Constance and her father, branded with the outcast mark and banished. Not imprisoned, exiled, into the human world, with nothing but the clothes they stood in. No pack would take them. No Lycan noble house would shelter them. They would go where the people they had despised went, to cities where status was earned by labor and survival depended on the willingness to do undignified work. You will scrub floors, Rodrik said. You will beg for bread in the cold. You will pray for the mercy of the people you once spat upon. The blacksmith's iron was hot and ready. When the screaming started, not a single person in the courtyard looked away. On the 14th day after the solstice, Genevieve opened her eyes. It happened without announcement, simply a gradual brightening at the edges of consciousness, the sounds of the room coming up through layers of dark and cold and the strange fragmented dreams of the very ill, until there was light, and a ceiling she didn't recognize, and the smell of something clean, and the specific particular silence of a room in which someone had been holding their breath for a long time. She turned her head. Rodrik Harrington was sitting in the chair beside the bed, his head bowed, his enormous hands folded on his knees. He looked, for the first time in any context she had encountered him, like a man stripped of all his structural authority, not diminished, exactly, but reduced. Human-scaled. The kind of grief had been on his face when she woke was the specific grief of someone who has had a long time to understand exactly what they did and exactly what it cost. He heard her move and his head came up. His eyes, golden, undone, met hers. "Genevieve," he breathed. He was across the room before she had fully registered he'd moved, falling to his knees beside the bed, reaching for her hand. "My mate, thank the goddess." "You're..." She recoiled. It was involuntary, faster than thought. She was back against the headboard with her knees pulled to her chest before she had consciously decided to move, her heart slamming against her ribs, her body running on the pure uncomplicated physics of the person who sent you to the dark is close to you and moving fast. Rodrik stopped. His outstretched hand hung in the air between them. He watched her face, the terror in it, real and immediate, the way her eyes had gone to his hands, then to the door, mapping exits, and she watched him receive this information with the specific particular devastation of a man being told something he had known was coming and had not prepared for anyway. He sat back on his heels. He put his hands on his knees, palms up. "You're safe," he said, and his voice was so carefully controlled that she could hear the effort in it. "I know the truth. Constance has been banished. She and her father were branded and exiled the day after you were brought up from," he stopped. "The day after I found you. Your mother told everyone what happened," he continued. "Before she..." Another stop. "Longer this time." Genevieve processed this. Processed the opulence of the room she was in, his room, she understood, the canopied bed and the velvet and the scale of it. Processed the scar she could feel running down her left cheek where the infection had eaten into her face, permanent, a second face she would wear from now on. "She's gone," Genevieve said. It was not a question. 3 days after the solstice. His voice was almost steady. Her heart gave out in her sleep. She was clean and comfortable and in her own bed, and she had spoken her mind at the feast. He paused. She went with dignity. "That was because of you." The silence between them was the densest thing in the room. Genevieve looked at him for a long time. At the dark circles under his golden eyes. At the clothes that had the look of clothes a person had been wearing for days, unable to focus on mundane things like changing. At the way his hands, resting upturned on his knees, looked oddly open for a man who had always appeared sealed against entry. "You want to tell me I'm your mate," she said. "You are my mate," he said. "I am not asking you to feel that. I'm telling you because you have the right to know. And you want to give me things," she said. "You want to crown me and put gold on me and make me the most powerful woman in the Northern Vales because your blood says I belong to you and you want to, what? Compensate? Repair?" His jaw tightened. "Yes. All of that, if you would let me." "You cannot compensate me for this," she said. Her hand touched, briefly, the scar on her face. A crown doesn't undo 3 days in the dark. All the gold in your treasury doesn't unfreeze the cell, or unring the blow, or bring back your mother. She met his eyes. "You didn't see me, King Rodrik. I was in this keep for 5 years and you never once saw me. You saw what I was, and you decided, and you were very confident, and you were entirely wrong." "Yes," he said simply. "A bond is not an apology." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She looked at him for another long moment. Outside the windows, she could hear snow. The room was very warm. She was, for the first time in years, since before the sweating sickness, since before the cold and the cracked hands and the long grinding diminishment of it, genuinely, deeply warm. "Then what are you offering me?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then, time. And evidence. Nothing I say will mean anything yet. But I can show you, by what I do, whether I am capable of becoming the man you would choose rather than the man you were assigned. He looked at his open hands. I do not know if I am. I have not been, until now. But I intend to try, and I will do it without demanding anything from you in return. Genevieve said nothing. I will go, Rodrik said. You need rest. There is a bell on the table. Dr. Wire will be here within the hour. He will tell you everything and answer any question you have. He rose. He did not touch her. He crossed to the door with the careful, deliberate movements of a very large animal trying not to take up more space than required. He stopped at the door. The hawthorn tea, he said, without turning. I learned to make it. I've been brewing it for her ward in the hospital. The one we're building in the lower village. In her name. He paused. Dr. Wire named the children's wing for you. I thought you should know. He went out. Genevieve sat in the enormous warm bed in the silence he left behind and did not make any decisions. She let herself simply be in a warm room, in a clean bed, in a body that was hurt but alive, and she breathed, and she did not demand anything more of herself than that. Outside the windows, the snow fell over the northern vales, thick and clean and silent. She did not become a queen that winter. She became, instead, a presence, something new and undefined in the architecture of the keep, something the keep's existing categories had no particular framework for. Not a servant, not a noble, not a prisoner, not yet a consort. She wore plain wool dresses because she found she could not make herself wear silk, not yet, and no one insisted. She walked with a permanent limp from the cold's damage to the nerves in her left leg, and she declined the carved cane that was offered, walking instead with a deliberate, measured slowness that became, over time, simply the pace of her, the pace people adjusted to. She requested 3 things in the first week. First, access to the keep's treasury records, which she studied with the focused intensity of someone learning a new language. Second, a meeting with Dr. Johannes Wire, who arrived with his battered satchel and his flat medical pragmatism and his complete inability to be impressed by architecture, and who became, over the weeks that followed, her closest advisor and her most reliable friend. Third, Constance's seized assets itemized in full, because she had plans for them. Rodrik provided all 3 without question or comment. He did not hover. He did not offer himself. He was present in the keep. She could feel his presence the way you feel the structural load-bearing beams of a building, aware without being directly conscious, but he did not intrude on the rebuilding she was doing. He sat in the back of the council meetings she began attending, not as a recognized voice but as an observer, because she wanted to understand how the realm was run before she had any opinions about how to run it. He did not speak in those meetings unless she looked at him, and she looked at him very rarely at first. But she began to look at him more. She began to notice, the way he listened when she finally did speak, with a quality of attention that was not performative but seemed to cost him something, the effort of giving genuine weight to words he might previously have dismissed. The way he had spoken to Maester Leonis after the dungeon, she heard the story third-hand, sanitized, but the essential structure of it remained. If she dies, I will flay you. She noted it not as proof of something but as a data point. She noticed the hospital construction in the lower village. She visited it for the first time in February, bundled in her wool cloak, her limp leaving uneven impressions in the muddy construction site snow. Dr. Wire walked her through it, the wards, the supply rooms, the kitchen for the orphanage, the herb garden being laid out in the south-facing section for maximum sun. She looked at the carved stone above the entrance, the Beatrice Miller ward. Beatrice Miller. Both names. The Queen and the peasant girl's dead family, joined. She stood in front of the stone for a long time. She was aware of Rodrik, at a careful distance, watching her. She did not turn around. But she said, "It's well done." She heard him exhale. The year turned. The hospital opened in the spring, and on its opening day, Genevieve sat at a table by the entrance and personally reviewed the first month of intake records with Dr. Wire and the 2 human and 1 lichen physicians they had recruited. She instituted a pay structure for the staff that reflected actual labor and experience rather than status or species, which caused a moderate scandal in the keep's noble community and which Rodrik, when 2 lords formally objected, shut down with a single, quiet, "The Ash Queen's decisions in her domain are final." She heard him say it from the corridor. She filed it. She began to call him Rodrik, not in public, not consistently, but sometimes, in the work meetings and the quiet conversations about the lower village's water supply and the grain stores and the tensions with the Western Pact Confederacy. Sometimes just, "Rodrik, look at this number." Or, "Rodrik, come and tell me what happened in the southern passes 10 years ago, because this migration pattern doesn't make sense without that context." He came, every time, immediately, with the focused attention of a man who understood that each of these moments was a small, contingent gift. He left lavender on her pillow in the autumn, when the dried bunches came in from the village market. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. She was not healed. She suspected she would never be entirely healed, in the way that the scar on her face was not going to go away. It was part of the landscape now, permanent, and the landscape had been reorganized around it. She was not the person she had been before the dungeon, and she was not going to reclaim that person. But she was finding out who she was after it, and this person was harder and clearer and less inclined to be invisible, and in many ways she preferred her. 1 year to the day after the solstice, Genevieve stood on the balcony of the royal wing and watched the snow come down over the Greymount peaks. The keep behind her was quiet. The year had changed many things. The great hall no longer hosted the drunken, careless excess of the old court. The noble households had learned, through a series of specific and consequential encounters with the Ash Queen's unexpectedly sharp administrative authority, that the mistreatment of servants was no longer a cost-free activity. 3 lords had lost revenues. 1 had been temporarily banned from council. The keep's human staff had received a retroactive wage adjustment that was significant enough to cause visible shock in the accounts. None of it brought back Beatrice. None of it erased the scar, or gave Genevieve back the winter she had almost died in, or repaired the nerve damage in her leg. Rodrik had never suggested it would. He had simply, consistently, done the work of becoming someone who understood what he'd failed to see. She heard the balcony door open behind her. The particular weight and warmth of his presence settled a few feet away, careful, not crowding. She heard the gentle sound of something being placed on the stone balustrade beside her. A cup. Hawthorn tea. "I remember," Rodrik said quietly. "I remember what you did for her. Every night, alone, without anyone knowing, because it was simply what she needed." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Genevieve." She had her mind with her at the end. She knew who she was. She knew me. That was because of you. She heard him turn to leave. "Rodrik." He stopped. She turned. He was facing her now, and she saw, as she had been seeing for months and had been gradually letting herself see, the person inside the king. Frightened, in some specific and honest way. Not of her, but of his own capacity for the failure he had already demonstrated. Afraid, most of all, of being that man again, and unable to be entirely sure that he wouldn't be. This was what she trusted, she realized. Not his transformation. She was not naive enough to trust a year's evidence as proof against the architecture of a lifetime's assumptions. But she trusted his fear of himself. She trusted the way he looked at her limp sometimes, with a quick involuntary expression he didn't try to hide, not guilt-seeking absolution but grief-seeking no exit. She trusted that he carried it. She reached out. Her scarred hand, with its particular history of cracked knuckles and ash and hawthorn tea and the specific cold of a dungeon floor, came to rest against his arm. "It's cold," she said. "Stay with me." And in the quiet of the winter night, on the balcony of a keep that was slowly, incrementally, becoming something worth building, he stepped closer. She turned back to the mountains. He wrapped his arms around her, his warmth against her back, his breath in her hair, and they stood together in the dark and the falling snow and the clean cold air that smelled of frost and, faintly, of lavender. The bond that locked into place between them was not the dramatic snap of lichen legend, all silver light and cosmic declaration. It was quieter than that, a settling, a rightness, the feeling of something that had been held carefully at a careful distance finally being allowed to rest. She thought of Beatrice, the weight of her hand in the dark, the sound of her sleeping peacefully. She thought of Pip and Colm, and the blue sky, and the particular blue she had been waiting to find again. She had found it here, in the least expected place, in the most unexpectedly hard way, and it was enough. It was more than enough. They ruled for 61 years. The Northern Vales in the era of Rodrik and Genevieve Harrington became, over those 6 decades, something genuinely new, a territory in which the hierarchy of species was not abolished, the lichens were what they were, and the power differential was a structural reality, but in which that hierarchy operated within a framework of explicit accountability that had not previously existed. The Ash Queen's word was law in matters of civil administration, and her definition of civil was expansively generous, encompassing everything from hospital funding to the legal protections of human servants to the curriculum of the keep school. She was not universally loved. The arrogant found her terrifying. The comfortable found her inconvenient. But she was respected, even by the people who wished she would go away, because she was precise and consistent and genuinely impossible to argue with, and because she had a quality, honed by 5 years of working in kitchens and a dungeon year she never mentioned but never forgot, of understanding exactly how things actually worked as opposed to how powerful people preferred to imagine they worked. Rodrik, in the histories, was called Rodrik the Just, which was somewhat ironic given his beginning but was, by most accounts, accurate by his end. He was a man who had done a very wrong thing and had understood it fully and had chosen, every day after, to be different. He was not a saint. He was stubborn and occasionally wrong and sometimes still reached for the old hierarchical shorthand before catching himself. But he had the rarest quality in a powerful person. He could be corrected by someone who loved him and he could sit with the correction without requiring it to be dressed up as agreement. They had 2 children, both of them raised on the story of the hawthorn tea, not as a fairy tale, but as a lesson. This is what power looks like when it fails. This is what it looks like when it tries to repair itself. This is the difference between the two. The Beatrice Miller ward expanded, over the decades, into the largest medical complex in the Northern Vales, serving thousands annually, staffed by humans and lichens in proportion to their skill rather than their bloodline. Dr. Johannes Weyer, who died at 83 of natural causes and who had never once been impressed by architecture, had a portrait hung in the main hall beside Genevieve's, a small man with a battered satchel and an expression of concentrated pragmatic attention, and beneath it, he saw what needed doing and did it. Genevieve outlived Rodrik by 7 years. She spent those years finishing what they had started together, a treaty with the Western Pact Confederacy that established interterritory protections for humans, the first of its kind. She signed it in the council chambers of Stonebridge Keep, at the same table where she had once been invisible, an ash girl carrying a bucket, beneath the notice of the people who walked past her. She signed it as the Ash Queen, with her scarred hand, in her steady unimpressive handwriting that had been learned from a village schoolteacher in a village that no longer existed, and she thought of no one in particular when she did it, only the distance she had traveled and the people she had carried with her, and the blue sky, and the smell of lavender. The scar on her face looked, in her old age, less like damage and more like topography, part of the land of her, permanent and legible, telling anyone who knew how to look, I was here. I survived it. I built something anyway.